Want to welcome everyone to the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon here. We're in mile marker 7.4, and we welcome up Chris Bortlick. Chris, take it away.
All right, thanks, Michael. So as Michael mentioned, my name is Chris Bortlick. I'm an architect at the Microsoft Technology Center up in Boston, Massachusetts. So good afternoon where I am from, good evening, good morning, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Really appreciate you investing the next 50 minutes to join us. I also want to thank CoreView, who's decided to sponsor this session. So appreciate you sponsoring not only the event, but this session in particular. So if you haven't seen this slide yet, you haven't heard the news yet, the SharePoint conference is back in March. It is being rebranded as the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference to reflect the continued set of additional topics, whether it's related to Teams or the Power Platform. We do hope to be back in person again in Vegas up in March. So hopefully we will see you all there in a few months. Again, really want to thank all of our partners and sponsors. A huge community effort that's gone into doing this event. I know we're about 2/3 of the way home, so we're almost into the final stretch of the marathon here. We're coming up around, at least in Boston, with the Boston Marathon, with a Heartbreak Hill, they call it, where you kind of go in that last big push trying to get down there. I am not a marathon runner, but I've had some friends and family, and I know that the last bit of it, I think that last third of a leg is typically when things start to kick in. So hopefully we'll all make it through. We're caffeinated, and we'll get through the rest of the event. So the way the session is going to work is I'm going to have basically three main topics. A little bit of slides to kind of frame the scenario in the discussion. Most of the time, hopefully around 30 minutes or more, will be actual scenario demonstrations, both from a user perspective as well as an admin perspective. And then we do have some resources we're going to share at the end. This is a session that I've had the privilege to deliver a few different times at the SharePoint conference and Microsoft Ignite over the past few years. So I continue to update it and refresh it with content and resources and scenarios and really learnings based on the work that I do at the Microsoft Technology Center in Boston. I've been at Microsoft about 12.5 years, and my entire focus at Microsoft has been on helping enterprise customers move into our online services. I spent the first few years focused on premises, and the last 7 or 8 years really helping customers move into Office 365 and what was before that, the business productivity online services. Also work a lot with regulated industries, so particularly healthcare and financial services. And a big part of the concerns over the years has been helping these regulated customers and other industries migrate into Office 365 in a secure and compliant fashion. So I'm going to take some of those learnings, some of the conversations I've had with customers, and kind of boil it down into the session. Whenever I've had this conversation with customers, it really is a balance between security, compliance, governance, and usability and productivity. Before I joined Microsoft, I actually spent 14 years myself as an enterprise architect, as a customer. Fun fact, I actually worked with Chris McNulty for 3 years. He and I both worked at John Hancock, which is a financial services company here in the Boston area. We co-owned the SharePoint environment, so I inherited the SharePoint environment globally for John Hancock when Chris left the company. And again, you know, Chris and I and others have been in the industry for a long time, and we really understand and respect the balance between security and compliance with usability and productivity. And we know if we lock things down too hard, we're just going to drive users to go ahead and use shadow IT and non-sanctioned solutions or non-sanctioned devices. And certainly before I joined Microsoft over 12 years ago, it was a little bit different. There wasn't quite the availability of mobile devices and access to SaaS applications and other things. So really do appreciate and understand the balance that our customers are dealing with. So usually when I'm having this conversation with customers, I'm usually in a conference room at the MTC. Usually have a Surface Hub. We're doing a lot of whiteboarding. I'm not going to go ahead and do that. I've got a Surface Studio here, but you really don't want to be looking up my nose on my camera and seeing me kind of writing on my studio. So really, you know, I've kind of built out a slide that's usually a framework and a reference that we leverage when we have this conversation with customers. So you probably have heard Microsoft, really to us, the identity is the control plane. Jay just did a great session right before mine, really talking about identity and identity management and moving away from typically everything being on premises, on network. Really the latest buzzword in the industry is around the zero trust model. I'm going to talk about Microsoft's perspective around zero trust. We're really seeing more and more of this urgency around protecting individuals in organizations, especially given the impact of COVID-19 and more folks working from home. So it always starts off for us really with the identity. Then we think about the location of the person. The location could be where are they physically in the world, what country are they in. It also could be their location with respect to being on a trusted or a non-trusted network location. We then think about the device that the person's accessing the system from, whether it's a Windows device, an iOS device, an Android device, a Linux device. We think about the application or the service that they're ultimately accessing. At the end of the day, it really gets down to protecting the content and the data. And earlier in the day, Joanne Klein did a great session talking about information protection and data loss prevention, and I'm going to weave in some of those concepts here as well. And lastly, it's really about getting visibility across all these different dimensions and different layers across the platform. So from an identity perspective, the first step really is getting towards single sign-on. More and more organizations have embraced single sign-on, whether it's Microsoft solutions like ADFS or Azure Active Directory. But I still talk to customers on a regular basis that do not yet have a single sign-on strategy. They have multiple different identities. Maybe there's one identity for Office 365, a different identity for Salesforce, another identity for Workday. Some of those identities are cloud identities, and people do a really good job at provisioning the account initially. They don't often remember to delete and purge and deactivate the account as people leave the organization. Another big thing that we find is more and more organizations are typically the number one way people are being breached is through phishing attacks, and then the lack of multi-factor authentication, especially when people are working from home. So, moving towards having a single identity with single sign-on to access all of your applications, and then protecting those identities, especially privileged identities with multi-factor authentication, can mitigate a lot of the security risks that we see. More and more, we want to get people to think about things in the consideration of a group. A group of people can be managed manually, where we explicitly assign people to a group. Those members could be within the organization. They could be guest individuals from outside the organization. But more and more, we want you to be thinking about things around dynamic groups. How can we build groups based on specific information about our employees? Maybe attributes from Active Directory. What's their title? What's their department? And how do we move people dynamically in and out of groups as their roles within the company change? How do we think about attestation to make sure that the groups are still needed and the members of the group actually still need that access? And then certainly for the privileged accounts, we want to think about just-in-time and just-enough access, having this role-based access control, and really managing these privileged identities to make sure that if a privileged account happens to get compromised, hopefully it doesn't, but if it does, ideally we're protecting it with multi-factor. But even if that account is compromised, maybe not having that account have standing global admin rights, that if that account gets compromised, people then get the keys to the kingdom and can do anything within the service. Moving next, we talk really about the location. Again, are they in a trusted country or not? Are there certain countries where people shouldn't be accessing the service from? Are we thinking about trusted locations in terms of being on network or off of network or on a trusted IP? Again, more and more, we're trying to encourage customers, especially work from home, to embrace this idea around split tunnel VPN. So if people do have to use VPN to get access to resources for cloud services like Office 365 and others, we really don't want you to backhaul that traffic through your network, overload your VPN, overload your ISP, and really have a poor user experience, which again might frustrate end users and really throw that balance between productivity and security and compliance out of whack. We're going to talk a lot about conditional access and limited access as a key pillar through the session. And really, initially, I used to put this in the location bucket, but I'm really seeing this now as something that spans across all of these layers. From a device perspective, is it a managed device? Is it a traditional domain joined device? Is the account leveraging Azure Active Directory? Is it enrolled in Azure AD joined? Is it being managed via things like Intune, now Microsoft Endpoint Manager? And again, as we're thinking about these devices, and maybe it's a personal device, or it could be a bring your own device or a company provided device, expanding our device protection strategy beyond just Windows into iOS and Android and Linux and Mac devices as well. Potentially we want to have different policies for different applications or services. So maybe some companies have a more relaxed policy around Outlook and Outlook on the web, maybe different from when they're accessing content services like OneDrive for Business or Teams or SharePoint, any of the content services. But then extending that out to browser-based applications, maybe having different security policies and posture for accessing the service through the browser versus a thick client or a thick application. And potentially having different policies for third-party applications. Again, things like Salesforce or Box or Dropbox or Workday or other cloud-based services. And then lastly, leveraging things potentially like an application proxy to provide secure access to on-premises applications that can be protected and provided access through the single sign-on, and then wrapped through an application proxy as well. Ultimately, we want to think about data loss prevention and information protection. We want to think about advanced threat protection as well. So as people are sending emails within the organization or outside the organization, as we're collaborating with people outside the organization, maybe they're uploading files into Office 365. Maybe they upload a file into Teams. We certainly want to make sure we process the file to look for any known viruses. We also potentially want to look at those files being uploaded and see if there's any zero-day attacks on those files as well. If the file somehow gets onto an endpoint, maybe it came through a third-party cloud service or a thumb drive or something else, how do we actually make sure we detonate the file on the endpoint as part of our advanced threat protection strategy as well? And then how do we correlate those events and those signals across the user, their device, the content, and get a holistic view of what's going on across the organization? Which leads us into visibility. Certainly having tools like Microsoft Secure Score and Compliance Score to give you ongoing recommendations and best practices against your environment, giving you the ability to leverage that intelligent security graph that Ajay was talking about earlier, and the telemetry, the billions and trillions of signals that we're seeing across the service, whether it's consumer services or enterprise services, and actually feeding that into some of the recommendations that we're making. We talked about compliance score for, again, ensuring compliance with things like certainly GDPR and NIST and other emerging compliance regulations. Again, feeding in some of those threat intelligence and those signals that are there. Integrating with a cloud app security broker, such as Microsoft Cloud App Security, for, again, protecting things through an application proxy as an example. And then also integrating with any SIM system, whether it's Microsoft SIM like Azure Sentinel, or traditional SIMs like Splunk, or QRadar, or Logarithm, or others, where we might want to integrate so we get a single pane of glass of all of our security incidents and events, and we're monitoring, and we're correlating all these different alerts into incidents and campaigns to get better visibility that if an attack does come in, which people were attacked, which devices were infected, and how did that spread throughout the organization. So usually what this results in is something that looks a little bit like this. So typically, I'm again at the Surface Hub on the whiteboard. I'm usually doing a lot of whiteboarding. These little boxes, typically me trying to map for the customer. Look, this is based on what you already own. This might be, we have to pay Microsoft a little bit more money, which is that green pen, or that sparkly pen might mean you pay Microsoft even more money between kind of an E3 or an E5. And again, like Ajay said, I don't get into licensing much. I'm not a licensing specialist, but again, do know enough about it because it comes up a ton in our session. So you heard Ajay talk about it, you heard Joanne talk about it. Your mileage may vary as far as some of the capabilities we're going to show you, whether or not you have access to it. Whether you're in a commercial tenant versus an education tenant versus a government tenant, whether your license plan includes it or not. So usually as part of the MTC sessions that I facilitate, they're usually full day to multi-day. And the exercise of just doing the whiteboard typically is anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. Just really going through and trying to understand how is the customer doing things today, how are they doing it, whether with Microsoft or a third party, and actually helping them to identify and rationalize their security and compliance portfolio, as well as identify what gaps they might be trying to close as well, and really trying to customize and tailor our recommendations to the customer's needs. Now, I usually don't use a lot of our kind of standard marketing slides, but this is a slide that our cybersecurity team created that I've started to leverage a bit more that I think is really, really helpful and useful. Again, it starts to map in some of the products, but I do like this because it does start to convey some of the more advanced concepts. I'm going to get into the demo in a second. So I talked about really, leveraging Azure Active Directory as that control plane, leveraging things like B2B and B2C for bringing in federated guest users. But really, when we start to think about conditional access, it certainly is understanding who is the user and understanding signals about them, doing multi-factor authentication, whether it's with Azure MFA, whether it's a phone call, a text message, using a notification on the app, leveraging a partner like YubiKey as an example with a FIDO 2.0 compliant device if you need a key fob as an example, leveraging things like Windows Hello for Business, potentially to use biometrics to authenticate with the device, and then having a certificate on the device and storing those credentials uniquely on that device based on the TPM chip that's there and that signature on the device, and really trying to understand that, but also understanding what's happening about an identity. Has a user account been compromised? Is their account, is their password being sold on the black market, on the dark web that's out there? And potentially using that as a signal to help us identify the session risk. Is the user doing an impossible travel scenario, like Jay mentioned, where maybe that person is in St. Louis or Boston or Philly a lot, and now they're traveling to India or they're traveling to China. Maybe that's an anomalous behavior, an anomalous pattern for a user, and that raises the threat level of one of the signals. Maybe they're trying to use a Tor browser to anonymize themselves. So again, using some of those user and session-based risks as part of our determination as part of a conditional access policy. Then looking at that device, understanding again, is the device compliant or not? Is the device enrolled in being managed? Defining device policies, such as a minimum or maximum operating system on the device, whether the device can be jailbroken or rooted or not, whether it can be backed up to third-party cloud services. Again, is the device being managed or not? And as we get into things with Defender Advanced Threat Protection, today having the ability to look for advanced threats and zero-day attacks on Windows, in Linux, in Mac devices, and soon iOS and Android devices as well. So again, extending that down as another signal on the endpoint to understand that maybe the device was compliant, maybe the device is managed, but maybe now there's a zero-day attack on the device, and that device basically gets quarantined. So much like a traditional network access control we might have done on premises, where we might have quarantined a user or device for failing some sort of network check as well. Certainly when we're evaluating and doing these conditional access checks, there's the idea around the initial access token when they're doing the initial authentication, and then there's the refresh token, and basically having the ability to invalidate and check as changes to posture go through, as the user account might have been compromised. Maybe we do things like detect that credentials have been leaked and then require the user to go through multi-factor, and maybe require them to do self-service password reset because their account has been compromised, and we want to go ahead and, again, not only revoke their session, require them to use multi-factor, but also make them change their password, or if they forgot their password, make them go through and answer some questions and kind of do the lost password, forgot password type scenario as well. Now, again, we're going to focus this session really around Office 365 and show scenarios around protecting things inside of Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive. But no, a lot of these same concepts can be applied into infrastructure as a service, whether it's running inside of Azure, things we can do inside of third-party applications like AWS, getting to third-party SaaS applications, such as, again, Salesforce or Box or Dropbox or ServiceNow. Again, leveraging the application proxy to do things with your legacy on-premises applications. And again, as you're going to see more and more, starting to use Microsoft Information Protection to define classification labels, not just for documents, but actually for containers, for a Microsoft 365 group, which things like modern SharePoint team sites, as well as Teams and even Yammer now are built on top of. So when we talk about conditional access and limited access, which is going to be a key part of the scenario we're going to walk through in a few minutes, we really want to think about protecting things, looking at the services, the groups of users, and then ultimately the files that they're accessing. So Microsoft 365 groups, originally Office 365 groups, have been around the service for a while. I still find that many customers still don't understand what they are. So again, I'll just build this out real quick and then we'll get into the demo. So first off, these groups are a membership service. It allows us to control whether it's a dynamic group or a manually assigned group or even a device-based group. What are the members of that group? These groups then have a modern SharePoint team set attached, which is where the files get stored. It has a shared notebook in OneNote. Planner gets attached to it, potentially the group calendar in exchange. Again, as also having that modern SharePoint team site, and then the ability to use connectors to integrate and bring in third parties' applications and services. The initial service, the very first service, it actually was called Outlook Groups back in the day, was Microsoft Outlook, to modernize leveraging distribution lists, to give it a modern way of having conversations with a site attached to it for sharing documents. When Teams came on board a few years ago, Microsoft Teams was built on top of Office 365 groups, and whenever you spin up a team, it creates a group. The documents inside of a team get stored inside of the associated SharePoint site. There's a document library, and those channels actually get stored in folders. Now, private channels get handled a bit differently. Those each get spun up as their own site collection, but the typical channels are stored as part of that default group that gets created in the site that's attached to that team. Microsoft Yammer is actually now leveraging groups as well. So it took us a lot of time and effort to migrate Yammer into our platform, get it into Azure, get it onto the same identity store with Azure Active Directory. I did a whole session yesterday around sentiment analysis for Yammer and showed the new modern Yammer experience. But there is the ability now to turn Yammer into Microsoft 365 native mode, which means the files get moved over to Office 365 groups, which means we can do things around data loss prevention, e-discovery, archiving, auditing, a lot of the things that we could traditionally do with Outlook in Teams for their usage of groups now applies to Yammer as well, which then gives us visibility through things like the Microsoft Graph and Delve and Project Cortex coming soon, as well as managing a consistent set of policies for security and compliance across the platform. And again, when I do this with customers, usually it's a little bit more whiteboarding, a little bit more discussion. Again, I wanted to spare you some of that effort, but here's another example of a customer-facing scenario as well. So that took about 15 minutes or so to kind of go through and frame out the scenario. Where I want to spend the next, again, 20, 25 minutes is really actually going through these scenario demonstrations. And then we'll get into some resources. So I'm going to focus on really looking at just-in-time and just-enough access. We're going to talk about limited access as it relates to the service. And then we're going to get into controls around groups and sites and some of the tools we built into the platform for giving you ongoing visibility around security recommendations as well as compliance recommendations. I'm going to break out of that and I'm going to start off my demo as one of my 3 personas. So I'm logged in here as Megan. Megan, if you notice, does not currently have any admin rights. So she currently is in there as a standard user. But Megan is a person that maybe needs the ability occasionally to elevate to get a higher level of permission. So if Megan goes into the Azure portal, you notice she has access to Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management, or PIM. PIM is something you don't have to license for the whole organization. I often find companies start off by licensing it just for a few of the admins, especially any global admin accounts that are out there. Typical best practice is to have as few global admins as you can. I typically want to have at least 2 of them just to make sure that you have a backup as well. But making sure that people have just in time and just enough access to elevated rights. So Megan, when she goes in and looks at her roles, you can see that the PIM administrator, who is actually me, has designated that Megan has the ability to elevate to either be a SharePoint admin or a team service admin. There are currently around 30 or so different admin roles that are available. Megan currently has no active roles that she's elevated under, but she needs to go in and do something for SharePoint. So she's going to go in and she's going to activate her PIM rights. You notice that the very first thing it does is it's requiring me to go ahead and validate with multi-factor authentication. This is the first time that she's tried to do this today. So it's going to go out and it's going to go ahead and send me a code, which is always the most exciting part of the demo, is me retrieving my code here. I could have set this up as well with the Authenticator app. I'm going to go ahead and punch in that code. I do that right. All right. So Megan has now gone in there and she's gone ahead and proven that she is who says she is. You notice that when I'm doing this, I do have the ability to specify how long this elevated right will stay active for, from typically 24 hours down to 1 hour. In this case, I've allowed her to be elevated for 8 hours. She could say she wants the elevation to happen sometime in the future, and we could require that she have a business justification and a reason. So my reason is I need to do a demo. It's always a great business reason. This could be a ticket in ServiceNow as an example. When I go through and do this, I can set it up so it can be automatically reviewed and approved, or I could require that actually it goes to somebody else and maybe a PIM administrator has to review and validate her requesting her elevated rights as well. Tip, if you do that and you have 24-hour day, 7-day support, that you have someone available around the clock to do the elevated approval requests. Otherwise, you may have some admins that are sitting there waiting for people to review and validate their requests. So now if I go back here and I close this out and I look at my active roles, you should see that I've elevated as a SharePoint admin. And if I zoom over here, you're going to see that if we're still doing this demo tonight around 11:22 this evening Eastern time, her rights are going to roll back to be a standard user as well. Now, taking a look at this from an admin perspective, I'm going to go over here as my admin persona. You notice that I just got an email notification telling me that this person has gone out and elevated. So I actually could get a notification with the justification. We actually do this in our environment. So Michael, who's helping me out today with the Q&A and producing the session, Jay, who was just on the previous session, we're all architects at various Microsoft technology centers. We actually built a shared experience platform that we leverage for all 55 MTCs globally. And we run it like a production environment. We have a QA environment. Each of us has our dev environment, which is kind of what I'm playing in here. We have a shared QA environment and a shared production environment. And we actually manage it where no one has standing admin rights. And we have to go through elevated rights and access requests through PIM. And only certain people are actually the PIM admins as well. So I'm going to go in here, though, in my environment, and I'm going to look inside of PIM, and I'm going to drill into this. And you'll notice that I can go in and I can manage access. So if I look at managing access here, I certainly could do things like access reviews, which could set up a regular review. Maybe there was a case where maybe Michael needed something. We gave him assigned rights instead of putting him where he had to do just in time and just enough. We want to set an access review to remind us maybe in a week to go in and review. Does Michael still need access to that or not? Or maybe we have a process where as part of an audit requirement that every 3 months, 6 months, every year, we need to go through and regularly review which people are in the group that can be elevated to be a global admin, as an example. As I go in here, though, and I take a look at things, I can look at the resource audit. Again, before I do that, here are all the different roles that are available. You can see which people have it currently assigned, which people are eligible to elevate to that right, etc. So if I drill in here and I take a look at the resource audit, here is Megan, and I can look at it over, just today, over the last week, the last month. You'll see that I've done this demo and prep a few times. I went through initially when I ran PIM, and it actually gave me some recommendations around best practices, which I did accept. And again, you get a nice audit log that's telling you, which people were elevated during what time frame. Really helpful for auditors. Also really helpful from a change management perspective. If someone did elevate and someone made an unauthorized change, letting you know who was elevated during that window, so it's requiring the audit logs, and we're looking for the events. We can also go in there and actually look at what sort of activities were elevated and which people were elevated to perform those activities, which really helps us with looking at the audit logs to figure out who might have made what change and when. So that's really scenario one, focused around just in time and just enough elevation around admin accounts. Scenario two gets into looking at things around limited access. So Megan, as one of our personas, happens to be in a group of people that is set up that whenever she goes to access Office 365, if she happens to be on an unmanaged or untrusted device, or somehow fails some sort of other conditional access policy check, you notice that she does not have the ability to leverage the full capabilities of OneDrive for Business. So if you look here, the sync button is not available to her. If she clicks on this document as an example, the download button is not available to her. If she clicks on the open, the option to open up in Word and then do a save as is not available to her. But if she clicks into open in a browser and looks at this document, she can bring this up inside of Word Online. Again, she gets a similar sort of warning. Again, she can't open it. But one of the things that we can do right now, which is relatively new, is there is the ability to actually enable her to leverage information protection labels. So we do now have the ability, as Joanne was talking earlier, to allow people to read and set information classification labels, not only in the rich Office clients on Windows, iOS, Android, and Mac, but also the browser-based clients, including Word Online, which I happen to be using here inside the Google Chrome browser as well. So she does have the ability to go in and view and edit the document if that gives her the appropriate right. But again, she can't go ahead and do an open in Word, do a save as, and potentially download the content onto her non-managed or non-trusted device. Now, to compare that with a regular user, here's my persona. My persona does not have that same sort of policy. So you notice that I get the sync button. If I click on the Word document itself, I have the option to go ahead and do a download. I also have the option to go ahead and click on open and then go ahead and open it up in the Word app and do a save as. So defining this conditional access policy allows me to enforce this for anything that's built on top of SharePoint from a content storage perspective, which, as Jeff talked in the keynote yesterday, really is a lot of pieces across Microsoft 365, anything that's built on top of Office 365 groups. So things like Teams, anything built on top of SharePoint for content services, which includes OneDrive for Business in this case, can be governed with these same sorts of policies. Now, there is another way that you could enforce policies. Actually, there's two more ways that I'm going to walk you through. I'm going to walk you through the admin experience in a second around setting up the conditional and limited access policy that's available. But one of the new options that we do have available is through Microsoft Cloud App Security Broker to go ahead and do an application proxy as part of a session. So this persona here, Diego, is targeted by a different conditional access policy. Now, when Diego goes to click into OneDrive for Business, you're going to notice that this request actually gets intercepted by Microsoft Cloud App Security Broker. There is an option to hide this notification. Certainly the user can suppress it. You as an admin don't have to show it to users either. But I'm going to go ahead and say continue to Microsoft OneDrive for Business. And again, I'm showing you this in the context of a session policy applied to OneDrive for Business. This could be applied to other third-party applications that are being protected by Microsoft's CASB, inclusive of things, again, like Box and Dropbox and Google Drive. So while we're focused very heavily on Microsoft 365 today, I do want to show you that there are options for information protection and threat protection that could extend beyond the Microsoft Cloud if you wanted to do so. So now, in this scenario, I do have the sync button that's here. I also do have the ability to go ahead and click on this document. But when I go ahead and hit the download option, you're going to notice that even before I can click the download here, I get a message telling my download has been blocked because our Cloud App Security Broker actually has a policy that in this case is restricting the download of the content. Now, I could do a very broad policy that says any user on any device for any site, or I could have a more fine-grained policy that says maybe I'm going to restrict download based on the information classification in the label of the site, or the information classification and label of the actual document. Maybe documents that have been classified as highly confidential, as super secret, maybe those documents have a more restrictive policy than things that are classified as general or public. So I kind of walked you through, again, a couple of different ways of looking at things. One is we looked at the limited access policy through OneDrive. We then looked at the Cloud App Security Broker to go ahead and actually, again, protect things a bit more broadly. Let's take a look at what this looks like on the back end from an admin perspective. So from an admin perspective, the first one that we set up was basically a policy that was created and defined through SharePoint Online. So if I go into the policies node and I go into access controls, you notice that I have the ability to manage things around unmanaged devices. So if I look at this, you notice that I clicked on this option that said the user is coming through, and I'll show you the policy on the back end, but if a user is basically coming through some untrusted scenario, we do have the right to block them straight out and not give them access at all. But I'm going to go ahead and give them limited access because maybe they have a valid business reason. Maybe they're working from home, or maybe the case that Ajay mentioned earlier where he was traveling to India and he left his work laptop at home and he's in India now and he's going to do some work and he's on his sister's device, and we want to give him browser only access because he's on a non-trusted location on a non-trusted device. So we might challenge him with multi-factor to make sure that he hasn't been compromised, but maybe we give him browser only access. Or maybe he's visiting his parents or his grandparents and he's on grandma's PC, or he's at a library or somewhere else where he's, again, on a non-trusted location on a non-trusted device, but he's passed some of the other checks, and we want to give him, again, browser only limited access as an option. Now you also notice that there is a message showing up here around modern auth. There is the ability to turn off and disable basic authentication. So basic authentication is something that's been around since before the Office 2010 days. Office 2010, as you probably know, is going end of support in October of 2020. It's exiting its 10-year support cycle. Microsoft is aggressively trying to encourage customers to move away from basic auth to modern auth, which gives us the ability to do this sort of adaptive authentication. Again, we do give you the option, if you're ready to go ahead and turn off basic auth and require modern auth. But that warning that you saw before saying that if you do have a legacy client that doesn't speak modern auth, you don't have some of the same level of control and management that you do with modern Office clients like 2013 SP1 and later, which again works across Windows, but also on Macs and iOS and Android and browser-based clients as well. So when I clicked on this policy, what it did was it actually went ahead and it created a set of conditional access policies for me. So I'm going to go back here into Azure Active Directory. And again, I'm going to give you all the articles and the blog posts and content that I've prepared over the years that continues to be updated, so you can go through it and follow this step by step later on. But I'm going to go back into Azure Active Directory. All right, well, if this doesn't work, I do have a backup here. Just tempting the demo gods. Do one more thing real quick, and then I'll punt to my backup real quick. All right. Well, the way the conditional access policies got enforced is back inside of Azure Active Directory. Two conditional access policies got created for this. One is around looking at things around an unmanaged device, as well as browser-based access. And I'll get to the blocking sensitive downloads in a second, which is the scenario around the Cloud App Security Broker. So the first thing that you do when you create these policies is, first off, you look at defining them based on which users or groups are affected. Typical best practice is to apply it based on groups of users. You notice that you can apply different policies for guest and external users as well compared to internal users. The way we do it at the NTC is we actually have a group that's built dynamically, looking at the title of certain personas and roles, and anyone that's in that group has the policy applied to it. Then you define which applications and which services are governed by this policy. So in this case, I applied it to SharePoint Online. There is now an option to pick Office 365 as an overall entity as an app as well. And you see that recommendation to say, we now recommend you apply it not just to SharePoint, but to Office 365 overall. Then you go ahead and you can define, different criteria around, what's the sign-in risk, if it's a risky sign-in, different policies for different device platforms, trusted locations versus non-trusted locations, what's the health of the device as well. But the key thing for this policy is we defined it based on whether they're accessing the application through a web browser versus a full client. And then we check the box to say, use this app enforced session restriction. This application enforced restriction is what then tells SharePoint and OneDrive to go ahead and render things with a limited access policy. Because again, maybe that user, didn't have the appropriate device, they were on an appropriate device, they weren't, leveraging the appropriate client, what have you. We can go ahead and enforce the application restrictions, which told SharePoint and OneDrive to trim and turn off the sync button, or turn off the download button, or turn off the ability to go ahead and open up in the full Word client. Now, the second policy that I created that affected Diego was actually leveraging this option to say, use a conditional access app control. Right now, there are a couple of standard policies. One is this preview policy to block all downloads. And when you do that, we can actually then go over to Microsoft Cloud App Security. And inside of Microsoft Cloud App Security, we can then configure certainly all the Office 365 services and apps like SharePoint and OneDrive, but we can also configure more fine-grained control policies that says maybe it's not just looking at when it's someone accessing OneDrive or Teams or SharePoint. Maybe we also want to have a different policy that's looking at things when it's only sensitive content that's been classified as being highly confidential or super secret or whatever. So again, you get some more fine-grained controls that you can do through Cloud App Security as well. So let me go back here and see if this, of course, Murphy's Law went ahead and it rendered after I clicked away, but that's kind of the same sort of gist of what I would have walked you through from a demo around the conditional access policies. So about 15 minutes to go. The third scenario that I want to start to pivot over into is around classification, labels, and protection of doing things based on groups. And as I mentioned, services like Microsoft Teams are built on top of Office 365 groups. If I go back over to my friend Megan, you notice that Megan has a few different teams that she's an owner of. So one is this very original team named Megan's Event Team. And if we look over here in the upper right-hand corner, you notice that this team has been classified as general. And if she goes in, she can go ahead and invite in members. So for example, she could invite someone outside the organization. You notice that she's getting this recommendation here that you can invite guest users, and my Microsoft.com user is a guest in this tenant. But if she goes over to this other team called Do Not Tell Everyone, which you notice has a classification label of super secret, and she goes to do the same thing, and she wants to go ahead and add a member, you notice that I don't get the option to add guests. If I go in here and I instead try to do the same thing, and I try to add in my account, you get that message saying that we didn't find any match, which means that user is not already in Azure Active Directory as an approved user that can be shared with. So this gives you the ability to manage who can be and whether or not guest access is allowed for specific teams or anything based on a group based on the label. Now, the way that got applied here was if I click into the create a team and I say build a team from scratch, and I pick a sensitivity label, here's that super secret label. And when I did that, you notice that it's giving me a little tooltip here saying me, only teams can only be created of the privacy type of private if it's being labeled as super secret. So this is really NDA stuff here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create it. And now as I do that, it's going to walk me through the standard kind of Teams wizard. I'm not going to add anyone else right now. But now again, as this team got created, you notice that it got labeled here in the upper right-hand corner as being super secret. So Mike Mulcahy, if you haven't seen already, did a series of great sessions at Microsoft Ignite back in the fall. It's got a really good blog series that goes through a lot of controls and management around fine-grained precision around guest access and potentially turning off the ability for self-service and self-creation of teams. So a lot of customers have wanted to disable self-service or have more control and governance, and Mike built a great solution with a Power App and a flow to kind of manage that. Some of those things are being more mainstream now into the core product to give you some more fine-grained controls as well. And the way I actually created this policy, I go back here to my admin persona, and I go into the Security and Compliance Center. What you'll see here, if I click into classification, is I now have the ability to look at things around sensitivity labels. So these sensitivity labels, you'll notice that I have one that I created that's called super secret. And the way that this is done is you can assign least restrictive to most restrictive as a label. If I click into this label itself, and I'm not going to create a new one right now, just given we have about 10 minutes left here, and I look at this label, you'll see that one is I can go ahead and say if something's been labeled, do we assign an encryption policy to it? Do we want to go ahead and put a header or a footer or a watermark on the document? But this is the key thing for the demo we're doing right here. If someone applies this label, we want to say that the privacy of the group has to be private only. We're not going to allow them to invite external guest members into the group. Again, this is a group that could be through Teams, through Yammer, an Outlook group, anything that's built on top of Office 365 groups, now Microsoft 365 groups. And we can also go ahead and do things to say, hey, we're going to give them browser-only limited access as part of this policy. We also do have the ability to do auto labeling if we wanted to as well, where we can go ahead and look for sensitive content or sensitive information types and go ahead and automatically apply a label to the content as well. Once that label gets created, you then go out and you publish the label. And I went ahead and published this. The label itself, I then published it to make it available to all users in all groups. And I could even go ahead and say, you know, users have to give a business reason if they change the justification from a higher level label to a lower level. You know, we might have to require that the label be applied to emails and documents, et cetera. So again, we're starting to mainstream the information protection capabilities to not only apply them to documents on Windows and iOS and Android and Mac, build them into the browser client as you saw, but also now give us the ability to apply the label at the group level, at the container level, which again applies to things like Microsoft Teams, as well as things like modern SharePoint team sites. The other thing that we can do with these groups is, you notice that Megan is the owner of a group. We also can go ahead and set up an access review. So maybe Megan had that Megan's event team, and there are internal members of the group as well as potentially external members of the group. Well, Megan is the only person that really understands potentially who the members are and whether or not the right people are still needed to be accessing the group. So if I go through the starting of the review here, you're going to see that we also have the ability to have recommendations where the tool can go and say, well, look, you know, these are the 3 members of the group. They last signed in within 30 days. Maybe we go ahead and we recommend that you approve them or we revoke them or what have you. So again, giving you a more fine-grained kind of way of reviewing on a regular basis as the owner of the group, who needs access and who doesn't. Also have the ability as an admin, if I go back over here, to go in, and this should be available to me now, going back inside of Azure Active Directory, again, looking at my groups, to not only go through and set up those access reviews, but also to go in and define expiration policies where maybe you want to, on a regular basis, have these groups be reviewed to make sure the groups are even still needed or not. Now, I know I'm coming up on time, about 8 minutes left. I want to go through another quick scenario there and bring up some of the resources. I do want to point out that the classification labels that I did for the group today is in public preview. There is a PowerShell script that you need to run to actually turn that on. Again, I have the links that I'll give you to actually do this. But basically it does require you to use the preview module of the Azure AD preview module. And there is the ability, as Joanne showed earlier, that you can define your own classification guidelines as a page, that when someone actually wants to get more information on what is considered high risk versus medium risk versus super secret, you can actually go ahead and give them a link to a page on your intranet that gives you more information in user-friendly terms of what the different policies and labels mean. So the last piece that I want to review before I go back into content and then talk about some recommendations is Microsoft has built in a number of tools directly in the platform to give you ongoing reviews and recommendations. So historically, when customers were on premises, you might have hired Microsoft Premier Support, and they came out once a year and they did a risk assessment for you. They ran some scripts, they gave you a report. You went in, you remediated it or not. Maybe you hired a partner to do a review. The challenge was that as you continue to change things, and especially in the SaaS world, as we continue to change things within the platform, you need to get ongoing recommendations and reviews. It's no longer enough to just do a security assessment or risk assessment once a year. So SecureScore is a tool that's available to you to give you ongoing reviews and recommendations. You can then go ahead and look at your history over time. You can see kind of points and gamification around it. And again, as we continue to learn more, We'll share with you new recommendations as you make changes in your environment. As we roll out new services, we're giving you ongoing security recommendations. From a compliance perspective, we've built something similar called Microsoft Compliance Score, which enables you to go in and look at this from a compliance lens. So certainly looking at things around certain categories around information protection or access controls or device management, but there are also a number of pre-built assessments. There are baseline assessments. There's also the ability to look at things based on certain applications and services. But again, as you start to look at some of the different assessments that are available, there are also a default baseline assessment, but there's also other assessment templates you can add for looking at things like GDPR compliance, NIST compliance, and other compliance frameworks. And again, the nice thing is that as we continue to see the services evolve, as you continue to make changes, we're going to continue to review and make recommendations on an ongoing basis as well. So 5 minutes to go. I'm going to kind of close things out here and make sure we save time for Q&A as well. So again, covered a lot around that just-in-time and just-enough access for your admins. We looked at different ways of applying limited and conditional access to applications as well as sites, and we talked about visibility. This is one other slide that I'm going to just build out for you and just kind of leave it to you as part of your reference that did come from our cybersecurity group, is looking at ongoing visibility around typically going in and grabbing things from the raw event logs through the management activity APIs to bring them into your classic SIEM, but also as we talked about the work that we're doing inside of Microsoft to bring in information protection, but also bring in all the different signals in that end user behavioral analytics that we're seeing around Microsoft Threat Protection, how we're correlating the signals, how we're bringing in information from that security graph, how we're bringing in humans to look at things and our threat hunters, and then potentially actually having the ability to engage Microsoft through our threat experts, our incident response teams, as well as the ability to leverage SOAR for security orchestration, automation, and remediation, whether it's through your existing SIEM or through Microsoft's cloud-based SIEM, Azure Sentinel, which gets into a lot of things around Jupyter Notebooks and doing things with Azure Runbooks and other ways of automating responses to any sort of threats that might be popping up in the environment as well. So in summary, really, as you think about it, if you take nothing else away, number one recommendation I make to customers is make sure that on an ongoing basis, someone is reviewing and has responsibility for looking at secure score and compliance score, as well as on an ongoing basis reviewing things that we're making alerts in the message center around new capabilities. Make sure you protect your privileged accounts. It's typically one of the number one recommendations in Secure Score is having too many global admins, not having just-in-time and just-enough admin rights, not having the privileged accounts protected through multi-factor authentication, and then thinking about conditional and limited access, ideally, at least for your admin accounts, but also for your standard users, especially as people are embracing the zero trust mentality, people accessing things from anywhere, from any device, from any network. We want to make sure that those users aren't being compromised, their devices aren't being compromised. We're staying on top of all the different emerging threats that are going on out there. Here are the resources I referred to earlier. So I put some short links. So here are some of the resources from the last time I presented the session at the SharePoint conference, which again, has been updated. Here's Microsoft's perspective around zero trust, including a tool you can use to assess your current status on zero trust. Here's how you can enable the labeling for Office 365 groups and teams and SharePoint sites, as well as if you want to enable sensitivity labels in the Office Online clients as well. Talked about this before, but really appreciate any feedback you have, as well as going through and visiting our vendors that are sponsoring the event, as well as submitting your answers to their questions for the raffle. And if you do have the opportunity and the ability to do so, again, really appreciate any donations you can make to the different charities. Again, 10% of all of the sponsor funds are going towards community relief to help all of us deal with the response to COVID-19. Again, would love your feedback on this session or any of the other sessions presented by any of the other speakers, as well as the event overall. Again, we do plan to keep doing these sorts of events and would love to get your feedback. And with that, again, there's my information again on Twitter, as well as my blog. So if you do have questions, certainly, Michael's in there monitoring the queue. I know we've got about 2 minutes or so left before we need to kind of wrap up here. Please do feel free to throw any questions you have in the Q&A, where we're happy to answer them now, or feel free to reach out to me through LinkedIn or Twitter. I will be sharing these slides later on. They're also going to be shared out through the session or the event organizers, the session recording, as well as the slides we published